Hi, good morning, Chair. I can do that, Chair. Thank you. My phone is on. Ms. Motakatsi? Ms. Motakatsi is on the platform, Chair. Dr. Kigaba?
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, honorable members and all our guests. I'm here.
Mr. Chance?
Good morning. I'm present. Thank you.
Mr. Thring?
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, colleagues.
Mr. Langa?
Good morning, Chair. Present.
Mr. Koza?
Morning, Chair, colleagues. I'm present.
Those are Mr. Gama?
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, members. I'm present.
Chair, those are members currently on the platform, Chair. Others may still join us, Chair.
Thank you very much. Can we share the agenda? And then can we get the mover and seconder for the agenda?
Chairperson, I move for the adoption of the agenda.
Thank you very much. Member Buskas move. Seconders?
I second, Chair. Dr. Kigaba.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kigaba. Much appreciated. The meeting. Are there any apologies, Andre?
Chair, I have not received anything yet, Chair. Members may still do so, and I'll alert you to that, Chair, as soon as I receive it.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let me welcome the Deputy Minister and the entire delegation, the leadership of ITAC, as well as the leadership of the department.
Recording in progress.
You are all welcome. Welcome all members of Parliament and other stakeholders who are here. We have 2 items on the agenda today. We are going to be receiving a briefing about the international trade agreements, and then as well as the issues of the ITAC. The purpose of the meeting today is to receive the briefing on the status of South Africa's trade relation and ongoing trade negotiations, which will include an update on the current global challenges affecting South Africa's trade relations. Secondly, the development and or implication of the African, European, and Chinese trade agreement, amongst others, the implementation of the of additional tariffs by the United States, as well as the reform of the African Growth Opportunity Act, and the outcome of the World Trade Organization 14th Ministerial Conference, which was held in March. The briefing by the ITAC on its annual performance plan for 2026-27 financial year. The purpose is also to receive the briefing for this plan from ITAC. I will now invite the Deputy Minister Kodlimpi and the delegation to proceed with the first presentation. Over to you, DM.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Good morning. I must just indicate that I didn't see the agenda on the screen, so the sequence of how we proceed, I'm not very sure whether it's...
ITAC is number 2, so the first one is the trade negotiation.
Okay,
yes.
okay.
Apologies for that.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Honorable Chairperson. Good morning to the honorable members of the committee. Thank you once again for this opportunity for us to present elements of our work. As the chair started us off, he indicated that we are led by the trade branch, broadly speaking. So that would be DDG, Olelo Mlumbi Peter's work together with the DG. The issues are broadly the same, Chair, across what will be presented by the trade branch and ITAC. The objective scenario that we are sitting with is an increasingly volatile global trading environment, which presents a series of strategic threats, but also opportunities at the same time. And we've been reacting, therefore, to those, including some of the issues that you are raising about the trade deal between Africa and China, or South Africa and China specifically. All of these are in response specifically to what has been a volatile global trading environment since at least 2020. Now, our strategic orientation has been, as we've repeatedly said to the portfolio committee, the butterfly strategy, whose core is to consolidate South Africa's export growth in the African continent, but without decoupling from the rest of the world. So those wings of both East and West in the global environment are what occasions the nature of the trade agreements that we've brokered in the period under review, including what we are doing going forward. And it's always important to stress that our view of the world is that it will continue to be in flux for quite some time. As the major powers are decoupling from each other, they will all be desperate to secure markets elsewhere. Now, that presents a threat of an overcapacity problem where, if, for instance, China has been deploying a lot of its exports into the US market, it will now be blocked from that and it will try to find other alternative markets. That could pose a major threat if those goods are coming in at an extremely cheap rate. So that is why, as you'll hear when ITAC comes in, we are also combining our trade strategy with a consciousness to deploy trade remedies and other trade instruments from the vantage point of ITAC to insulate the South African economy not to be devastated. But the second area of opportunity is that as they are all scrambling for new partners, they are also scrambling for new supply chains. And that presents an opportunity there for South African exports to go both to the East and to the West, as well as continental Europe and the UK. Of course, we've said a lot in the previous period about trying to secure much more stable market access in the Gulf countries. You would understand that in light of the Iran, US, and Israel war, movement around that region has become a bit more volatile. But what is important is that it's not to treat that as a transitory point. That region is going to continue to be unstable for quite some time. And there are a lot of geopolitical explanations for that. So it means there are major risks associated with those new markets as well. I'm making the point, Honorable Chair and members, that in the international trading environment, there is no smooth sailing. There are headwinds across. We will do our level best to navigate that situation as it plays out to the best of our ability. But of course, trade data has been justifying what we are doing. There's been a lot of growth in our export performance despite this mess. And we've, of course, seen in the past week that the first tonnage of South African duty-free exports into China, it went in. I think the first tonnage was 24 tons of apples or so, which means at the back of the growth in exports that we saw last year, we are adding more into that as the Chinese market is kicking in. So that's the kind of story that we are coming in here to tell you, Honorable Chairperson. So with those, I will allow the department to kick us off with the actual slide presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chair. Thank you, DM, and good morning, Honorable members. Apologies, the slides are moving. I will start by... Apologies, there's a problem with the slideshow. Can someone assist to move the slides? Unfortunately, it seems there's a problem with my laptop. It doesn't want to move the slides.
Seconda, would you be able to share the presentation? Or this slides?
Thank you very much, and apologies for that, honorable members. The laptop sometimes gives problems. I won't cover the first slide because I think both the honorable chair and the DM have outlined what the focus of the presentation will be. Next slide, please. In terms of I think it's now moving, so let me try. I'll indicate if there's a problem. In terms of the global outlook, as the DM has indicated, we're seeing some headwinds. The America First trade policy has led to the rise in tariffs and the implementation of tariffs, especially by the US for various reasons, whether due to unfair trade or to deal with the trade deficit, drugs, or we'll see now later in the slide that they are implementing or looking to implement measures under or to address forced labor. And the concern is that we're seeing a number of trading partners moving away from a rules-based multilateral trading system towards trade policies that are increasingly shaped by national security concerns, economic resilience strategies, but also driven by domestic industrial policy imperatives. This shift has been reflected in the extensive use of unilateral trade measures, not only by the US, but also other trading partners to also deal with issues such as the environment. And we're seeing a rise in tariffs, including trade barriers, as well as investment screening mechanisms. And these are often justified on geopolitical grounds in view of rising geopolitical tensions. And of concern to us is the fact that the traditional markets that were ordinarily predictable and accessible to South African exports are increasingly becoming inaccessible. And these unilateral actions create a fertile ground for trade wars, and these will have disproportionate impact on developing countries, especially African countries. And trade wars, by their nature, are welfare reducing, and they have a significant impact globally. We are also witnessing the weakening of the multilateral trading system, and trade that used to take place under WTO rules amounted to 80% at the beginning of 2025, and this has reduced to 72% currently. What we are also witnessing, which is a key issue of concern, is disregard for the core principles that used to underpin the multilateral trading system, whether it is the principle of non-discrimination through the most favored nation treatment, or special and differential treatment, or consensus decision-making. As DM has indicated, our trade strategy is premised on the butterfly strategy, and it's about consolidating existing traditional markets while opening up new market access opportunities in other markets that we currently do not have preferential access with. And at the core of that strategy is the African continent through the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And the point is to diversify our export markets as well as our export products so that we can promote the resilience of the South African economy. We are also adopting a targeted approach to trade negotiations, so there's no one-size-fits-all policy. Effectively, we are navigating the difficult trade environment by identifying where we could conclude trade agreements, but conclude it in a manner that still protects and preserves our industrial base, but also targeted in terms of which vehicle, in terms of a trade agreement, we would want to negotiate. In some circumstances, it is comprehensive free trade agreements, and you will see that in the context of the African continent. But with other countries, we are looking at targeted agreements, whether preferential trade agreements or limited scope agreements, or sectoral agreements that are targeted at forging regional value chains or industrial value chains that will ensure that our exports are able to access the market. In terms of the trade performance, as the DM has indicated, we have seen a growth in our global exports to 2.1 trillion rands. And the key trading partners are the continent, which accounts for 26.7% of our global exports. And the amount is 557 billion in exports. And out of that, SACU is a key component, accounting for over 200 billion of that. Then Africa is followed by the EU at 19%, China at 11%, and then you have the US at 7%, Japan and the UK at 5% respectively. Then if you look at imports, they amounted to 1.9 trillion, and the key import partners are EU and China at 23%, the Middle East at 12%, and then India and the US at 7%, with the rest of the continent accounting for 9.3%. Then in terms of the surplus, there was a slight increase from 2024, which amounted at 197 billion to now in 2025, 202 billion in terms of the surplus. If we now drill down on the continent, we'll see that the 557 billion in exports into the rest of Africa is accounted in terms of majority by SADC. So SADC, including SACU, accounted for 469 billion rands of exports, and the rest of the continent outside of SADC accounted for 87.5 billion rands. But with the implementation of the AfCFTA, we do see a potential for an increase in our exports in the markets that we currently remain untapped. In terms of the potential, the export branch has targeted 1.1 trillion rands by 2030 in terms of our exports to the rest of the continent, and we do highlight key products of export potential, including minerals, mineral resources, machinery and electronic equipment, vehicles and chemicals. And then from an import perspective, we're currently standing in 2025 at 175 billion, and SADC accounts for, again, majority of that, 117.2 billion, and the rest of Africa, 57.9 billion. In terms of the trade agreements, members would have seen this. The only change that we have is the new preferential market access into China that kicked off on the 1st of May. And when I go to the later slides, I will indicate the potential that exists as a result of that and the implications and what we are trying to do to support the exporters. But effectively, most of our FTAs are in the continent as well as Europe through the SADC-EU EPA, Mozambique, SACU plus Mozambique and the UK, as well as SACU and EFTA. That is where we have FTAs. And then we have a preferential trade agreement with Mercosur. We have one we are negotiating with India. We've resuscitated those negotiations. And then we have the preferential unilateral market access through AGOA, as well as the GSP, Norway, Switzerland, Russia, US, and Japan. And as I said, the new agreement or preferential access scheme that has been implemented by China from the 1st of May. Now, going into the specific agreements, looking at the AfCFTA, in terms of progress so far, there are 25 countries that have gazetted their tariff schedules and have begun to implement preferential access under the AfCFTA. In terms of new market access for South Africa, because we are trading with SADC countries under the SADC FTA, the new market access is in the 14 non-SADC countries, and we do indicate the specific countries. South Africa implemented the AfCFTA with effect from January 2024, and trade is continuing, and we will indicate in the next column the performance in terms of trade under the AfCFTA. Also important for the members to note is the fact that the negotiations on rules of origin have been finalized. So 100% of the rules of origin are now agreed under the AfCFTA, including with regards to autos as well as clothing and textile. In terms of the next steps under the AfCFTA, it is to negotiate on the remaining 10% because the current tariff schedules cover 90% of tariff lines. So what is now expected is for us to conclude negotiations on the remaining 10%. And in terms of the agreed modalities, 7% of that will be constituted of lines that will be liberalized, but on a longer time frame basis than the 90%. And then the 3% would allow countries to preserve specific products that they would not subject to tariff liberalization in order to maintain policy space. And those products are normally products that are sensitive for the countries and are critical to their industrial development and therefore will not be liberalized. So the negotiations will therefore be continuing on that 10% that is remaining. In terms of performance in exports under the AFCFTA, of course, we're starting from a low base because we are targeting countries we didn't have preferential access with. And exports so far amount to 2.6 billion, and that's between January 2024 to February 2026. Imports amounted to 2.1 billion, so relatively balanced trade in terms of both exports and imports. And we do indicate the export partners as well as the key import partners under the AFCFTA. Then the AFCFTA members will be aware also covers trade in services, and so far 50 member states have submitted their initial offers, and there are 5 priority sectors: financial, communications, transport, tourism, and business services. So far, it's the 5 EAC countries that have implemented their schedules. South Africa has also concluded its schedule of commitments, and this is awaiting approval by the AFCFTA structures. In terms of other protocols under the AFCFTA, we've already, as South Africa, ratified the protocol on competition policy, as well as the protocol on women and youth in trade. And we are in the process of ratifying the protocol on digital trade. Cabinet is expected to make approval for this to be submitted to Parliament soon. And the protocol on investment as well as intellectual property rights will also be ratified once the processes have been concluded. Now, moving to SACU and SADC, South Africa is the current chair of both regional bodies. In terms of SACU, the priorities for our chairship have been to navigate these difficult headwinds in terms of global trade by ensuring that as SACU, we coordinate the approach to the diversification of trade relations with third parties, but do so in a manner that preserves the common external tariff, given the strategic importance of SACU in terms of also being an export market for South Africa and for diversified products at that. And also important is the internal SACU agenda, which aims to transform SACU. And we have the reimagined SACU agenda that entails discussions about how we can tap into the SACU resources for the implementation of joint projects, both infrastructure as well as industrial projects. And this necessitates agreement on the establishment of a regional funding mechanism. And there's good progress that is being made in this regard with discussions now centering on, so there's an agreement in principle, but the issue is the mechanics of how we fund the regional fund. Also important is the unified engagement in trade negotiations with third parties, but also to address the challenges that we're now experiencing with some of the SACU members implementing import bans that affect mainly agricultural products, but also some industrial products. So there are discussions to look at how we can resolve this so that we can have a predictable market in SACU that allows for the free movement of goods within the region, which is what a customs union effectively is about. And also there's focused work on the development of regional value chains, including how we can use this to tap into the opportunities that exist in the AFCFTA. The priority is autos as well as critical minerals. Now, moving to SADC, the priority is to address the non-implementation of the free trade agreement commitments. We have a number of countries that are regressing in terms of implementing their own commitments, and we will use the chairship to have a targeted mechanism to address this. But also important, the implementation of the FTA commitments are critical to also ensure that we can lock in the regional value chains and drive the industrialization agenda of SADC. And therefore, we will also be hosting the SADC Industrialization Week in July that is aimed at identifying regional value chain opportunities in line with the SADC Industrialization Work Program. We are also advancing on the trade and services. Already there are 6 services sectors where we have already negotiated when the Trade and Services Protocol came into force in 2012. Now there are new services sectors that are being negotiated, including business services, environmental services, professional services. Now, coming into the bilateral agreements that exist between countries outside of the preferential access agreements, we have 76 that exist in terms of memoranda of understanding that are key frameworks to facilitate economic cooperation with various African countries. And importantly, these MOUs provide a platform to cooperate on trade and investment initiatives, as well as industrialization, as well as infrastructure development. But also importantly, they do provide institutional mechanisms through the Joint Trade and Investment Committees, where we discuss challenges with regards to trade and investment, including challenges that are experienced by our private sector that is based in the African continent. And therefore, they are important platforms to ensure the resolution of both trade and non-tariff barriers. Now, coming to the EU, UK, as well as EFTA, these are agreements that have been implemented for some time, fully operational and well utilized by our exporters. What is critical at the moment is to leverage the reviews under these agreements to improve market access. It's important for members to note that in terms of our industrial products, we have full access into all 3 markets in this regard. So where there are opportunities for new market access will be with regards to agricultural products. So that is the focus in terms of additional or improved market access. But also important, given the development of the decarbonization agenda, as well as green products, we are also looking at new opportunities for that in terms of sustainable aviation fuel, as well as hybrid cars and electric vehicles. As I've indicated, in terms of the EU and the UK, 90% utilization of these agreements, and the aim is to therefore unlock new market access opportunities, as I have indicated. There are challenges in implementation, especially with the EU, given the rise in environmental protectionism and measures that the EU is implementing that have a negative impact on our exports. CBAM continues to be a topic of discussion with the EU to find common ground, issues of deforestation, as well as methane gas regulations. But also important are restrictions related to sanitary and phytosanitary, as well as technical barriers to trade that affect a number of our products, including citrus, game meat, poultry, steel, automobiles, and wine certification. And on citrus, the WTO case is still ongoing with the EU related to the citrus black spot, as well as false codling moth measures. What is also a new development is that for the last 8 years, the EU has been implementing safeguard measures that affect South African exports of steel. In terms of the WTO safeguard agreement, the EU can implement it for a maximum period of 8 years. And now they are looking into a process, and they have launched the process in the WTO, what is called an Article 28 process, where a country or a member of the WTO is allowed to review its tariffs, the bound rate. So the EU is involved in that process, and they want to increase the bound rate in the WTO from 0% to 50%. Of course, this will have a significant impact because in some of the lines that the EU wants to increase, we do have a supplier interest. We are a major supplier, and in some of the products, we supply more than 10% of the imports of the EU, and therefore it's critical for us to engage with the EU to find how our concerns can be addressed. But also importantly, beyond the commitments that the EU has in the WTO, we also have commitments under the Economic Partnership Agreement, where the EU has agreed that it will grant us 0% in terms of tariffs, which gives us preferential access under the FTA. And therefore, ongoing discussions are continuing with the EU. We are expected to have a follow-up discussion in May to see how we can come to a common ground in this regard. In terms of EFTA, as I said, new opportunities are in agricultural market access, and there are discussions with EFTA. However, EFTA also wants market access into our own market, and therefore we are trying to find a landing zone that will be to the mutual benefit of both partners. Now, moving to other developments with regards to the SA-EU trade, the critical one is the Clean Trade and Investment Partnership that has been concluded with the EU that provides for accumulation for electric and hybrid vehicles, but also opportunities to collaborate with the EU in terms of battery manufacturing, but also a just decarbonization agenda. And as part of the CTIP, the EU has announced a global gateway package of 12 billion rands, and this effectively allows us to cooperate in terms of the implementation of projects. We have worked with InvestSA to identify 45 projects that fit the criteria of the EU in terms of clean partnership. And there are discussions to look at which projects we can cooperate on in terms of implementation. On the rules of origin front, we have agreed with the EU for a derogation under the EPA rules pertaining to the export of hybrids, which has allowed us to maintain market access to export our hybrids into the EU. The derogation is for a period of 3 years with a possibility to extend for a further 2 years upon request by South Africa. Effectively, what this partnership allows is for us to be able, as I said, to maintain market access, but also collaborate in terms of battery manufacturing. We are also in discussions with regards to the export of sustainable aviation fuel, and the CTIP also covers marine fuel as well. And therefore, there are huge opportunities here, including opportunities to collaborate with regards to hydrogen. There are also continuous discussions with the EU to facilitate the implementation of or exports of products that have composite products, including Amarula, to ensure that our agro-processed goods can access the EU market. Now, moving into Mercosur, this agreement was implemented with effect from 2016. It covers over 1,000 tariff lines, 16 and 17 sectors, respectively. Key products of export interest for SACU are catalytic converters, iron ore, the nickel, aluminium, and from the Mercosur side is chicken, maize, zinc, oil cake, as well as coffee. The issue of discussion here is that this agreement is not heavily utilized by our exporters. So we are spending a lot of time with our export branch to create a lot of exposure, especially given what is happening in traditional markets, so that our exporters can also leverage this agreement. Currently, utilization stands at around 36% of the tariff lines, and therefore there's a huge opportunity to grow our exports in those products that remain untapped. There are also discussions around a possible expansion of the agreement to cover products of export interest, and therefore we will be engaging with our constituencies to look at where the opportunities exist for us to expand market access. In terms of China, in February 2026, South Africa signed with China the CADEPA, and this is a structured framework to deepen bilateral economic cooperation with China. It provides a flexible modular approach to cooperation covering 4 areas. So trade and is one of those, inclusive growth, investments, as well as digital trade. With effect from 1 May 2026, China has implemented a preferential scheme that covers 0 tariffs on 100% of tariff lines with countries it has diplomatic relations with. And access, of course, depends on products that meet the rules of origin. And there are product-specific rules of origin on a limited number of tariff lines. And the trader, for them to be able to access this preferential scheme, they need to submit a valid certificate of origin. And we are working with SARS to ensure that traders can be assisted in that regard. We did issue a statement last week that outlines the process, including the conditions that the traders must meet, including the tariff lines that are covered. Some of the tariff lines are subject to tariff rate quotas, so we do indicate in the statement that it will be important for the traders to also take note of those that are subject to the tariff rate quotas. Our export help desk is ready to assist traders with any support, including information that they need clarification on. And further to this, China will be hosting a seminar on the 18th to the 23rd of May to assist the countries that are beneficiaries of this scheme to fully understand how they can take advantage of this. We also indicate in the statement that for products that are already in the water or left before the 1st of May, but will arrive in China after that, they need to note that they will have to pay a deposit and then get the certificate of origin retrospectively, and then they will be able to claim the deposit and will be refunded. So effectively, they will fully be able to access the preferential market access. The preferential scheme that China is implementing is for a period of 2 years because China has indicated that it wants to allow sufficient opportunity for African countries that have diplomatic relations with China to be able to negotiate early harvest agreements. And these early harvest agreements are aimed at meeting the WTO rules, and also are to be implemented in a manner that will not undermine industrial capacity of African countries. So it's going to be important that as we negotiate, and of course we are consulting with our constituencies in NEDLAC to ensure that we protect the industrial base of South Africa as we negotiate the early harvest agreement. And effectively, what this will do is to ensure that we are able to maintain the preferential market access into the Chinese market. Now, moving to India. With regards to India, we have concluded the terms of reference that will facilitate the resuscitation of the SACU-India Preferential Trade Agreement negotiations. So this was concluded on the 8th of April, and the terms of reference will be signed at the end of this month. And this will therefore provide a basis for the resuscitation of the negotiations. And our coordinator, which is Namibia, will sign define these terms of reference, and effectively a process will then ensue where we work on the request list for products that we would request India to open preferential market access on, and we are consulting with our stakeholders in NEDLEC in this regard. The expectation is that the negotiations should start in July this year. With regards to the US, the US, as indicated at the beginning, has implemented reciprocal tariffs that came into force. However, the Supreme Court of the US found this to be unlawful, and therefore they have been set aside. But also what is important is to note that AGOA has also been extended for a period of a year until 31 December 2026. So it does give South Africa still preferential access into the US. And when the US Supreme Court set aside the reciprocal tariffs, the US implemented a temporary 10% global tariff or to address the balance of payment challenges, and it was implemented under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. These tariffs are valid for up to 150 days in terms of that act, unless extended by Congress. And then on 12th of March, US communicated that it will be initiating an investigation under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 on 60 countries, including South Africa. And this investigation relates to whether there is a failure to impose and effectively enforce prohibitions on the importation of goods produced with forced labor. And immediately after receiving this, we have responded as South Africa, and this has paved the way for bilateral consultations between South Africa and the US, and these are scheduled to take place in May. We've also made a formal submission into the process outlining our legal framework as well as domestic legislation to deal with forced labor underpinned by our own constitution. Then, in terms of the modernization of AGOA, Congress is considering AGOA reauthorization, and the US has indicated that it is expected to provide recommendations to Congress on the reforms that must be implemented in order to modernize AGOA. So on the 29th of April, the US published a federal register requesting comments on modernization of AGOA, and the comments are due by the 15th of May. And in that register, the US has identified some concerns that it would want to address as part of the modernization. One includes the fact that there are few exporters under AGOA, so few countries that are taking advantage of AGOA, and that some of the countries are also maintaining barriers to US agricultural products, and they also include South Africa in that list. They also indicate that some of us have opened our market on a preferential basis to developing economies, outlining the economic partnership agreement as one of those. And there are a number of questions that are outlined in that register that interested stakeholders must provide comments on, including what needs to be done to ensure that the US is still able to increase their exports, address non-tariff barriers, but also improve resilience of the US supply chains, including critical minerals, which also gives the policy direction that the US may want to take, but also including issues such as graduation. And as South Africa, we will also be looking to work on a submission and submit comments in terms of our views in how AGOA could be modernized in a way that advances the interests of all parties. Now, moving to the WTO, as the chair had indicated, we had a ministerial conference at the beginning, at the end of March this year. That was held in Cameroon. So that MC14 effectively I guess, showed the difficulties that are facing the multilateral trading system. If you look at the outcomes that were achieved or lack thereof. Effectively, the challenges in the WTO reflect the challenges that are facing global trade broadly. Because there's limited progress in terms of ensuring that we have a predictable multilateral trading system through the enforcement function. And we have not succeeded to restore the dispute settlement system of the WTO. The WTO delivers very limited, if at all, developmental outcomes. There's also limited progress, even though everyone recognizes the need for reform, but the reform discussion in the WTO is moving at a snail's pace. What is also important is the fact that with the rise in unilateral and protectionist measures, the WTO has not been able to respond to ensure predictability, adherence to the rules, compliance to the principles that underpin the WTO, which has put into questions the effectiveness of the institution, one, but also of the multilateral trading system, especially to safeguard the interests of vulnerable members of the WTO. But what is critical is to note that all members agree that we need to reform the WTO. However, there are different perspectives in how the WTO should be reformed. MC14 therefore focused on one, reform, two, implementation of past mandates and whether the WTO is adhering especially to those mandates that relate to the development agenda. Also negotiations on agriculture as well as fishery subsidies, the dispute settlement, e-commerce and bilateral initiatives. In terms of the reform agenda, it's centered on three broad themes. The first one being decision-making, development, as well as special and differential treatment. And the third theme related to leveling the playing field. If we look at the reform proposals of the majors, one, we saw common elements in terms of what they would want to see, but some of it does raise concerns in terms of the underpinning principles of the WTO, because some of the proposals are calling for revisiting consensus decision-making, limiting access to flexibilities only to least developed countries, which means that South Africa will no longer have access, if this is agreed, to special and differential treatment, even though we have our own challenges that we have to deal with. There was also a view of expanding plurilateral approaches, re-examining the most favored nation or non-discrimination principle of the WTO, and all of these are key cornerstones of the multilateral trading system. A number of proposals are put on the table, including opening the discriminatory treatment among WTO members, introducing differentiation among developing countries, strengthening disciplines on industrial policy, as well as state-owned enterprises, and embedding these in a post-MC14 work program. In terms of outcomes for MC14, effectively, there were two decisions that were approved. It's the ministerial decision on work program on small economies to promote their integration into of small economies into the global economy. And the second one related to enhancing, again, it was best endeavor language on enhancing precise, effective, and operational implementation of special and differential treatment in the application of sanitary and phytosanitary, as well as technical barriers to trade agreements of the WTO. And in terms of issues that could not be agreed, it was the ministerial declaration, because normally out of each ministerial conference, there's a ministerial declaration that outlines future work, including what members are agreeing on in terms of the premise for the future work. So we could not agree on a ministerial declaration on WTO reform and work plan. And all of these issues are now going to be discussed back in Geneva by the ambassadors. And the other one is a draft ministerial decision on electronic commerce, decision on moratorium on TRIPS non-violation and situation complaints, ministerial decision on fishery subsidies and the LDC package. So what this means is that even though there were very good discussions on WTO reform, the discussions were inconclusive, and therefore we've agreed that we will take the discussions further in Geneva in terms of the reform package, including the work plan, with a view to try and deliver something by MC15 in 2028. There was also no consensus to integrate the investment facilitation for development agreement into the WTO framework. And members that have concerns have raised concerns with regards to the systemic challenges of integrating plurilaterals into the WTO, but also importantly, they have open room to say what will be important is to look at what should be the guardrails if plurilaterals are to be integrated into the WTO framework. What should be the guardrails that ensure that plurilaterals do not undermine what the WTO was set up to do, which is to pursue multilateral outcomes. The two moratoria on e-commerce, as well as the TRIPS non-violation and situation complaints, unfortunately could not be agreed and have expired at the end of March. There was no outcome on agriculture, and members would be aware that this is an issue that is of critical importance to the continent, including South Africa, because there are trade distortive subsidies that are implemented by the major economies that have implications in terms of how our agricultural products are able to compete first in the domestic market and let alone in the international market. And of course, this has also food security implications. And given the limited outcome at MC14, there was agreement, as I said, that discussions will continue in the WTO with a view to find a way forward on all the issues that could not be agreed. Thank you very much, Honorable Chair and Honorable Members.
There you have it.
Yes, if you can proceed, DM, with the second presentation, please.
Okay, thanks, Chair. We will now do the ITAC presentation. And in similar spirit to what we've just presented now, the situation around ITAC is again in trying to react to the evolving global trade environment with a view of protecting South Africa's economy as best as we can. And there's been a series of things in the ITAC portfolio within this period. You might recall, Chair, that we are trying to solve for the influx of imports into South Africa in various sectors, including the poultry sector and the sugarcane sector, the steel sector, and. Now, ITAC has been trying in that period to defend the South African economy from cheap imports and has issued a series of policy statements in that regard, including trying to impose trade remedies against imports from different countries. Now, here is where our work tends to get the more interesting, politically speaking, in the sense that whilst from the trade policy point of view, we are doing our best to negotiate trade deals with different countries and promote South Africa's market access in different jurisdictions. There are instances where some of our core trade partners are posing a strategic threat to particular sectors of the economy through a series of trade maneuvers. It could be underpricing, it could be deploying subsidies in their sectors, in their domestic economies, and therefore coming into the South African economy at a much more cheaper level and having the implication of affecting the competitiveness of our economy. This becomes a bit of a thorny issue because some of our trade partners assume that because we're negotiating at the grand level a preferential trade agreement of sorts, we shouldn't be deploying trade remedies against them. And striking a balance between the two is a bit of a thorny issue of state policy craft. But I think in the recent period, ITAC has done pretty well. We've had to respond to problems that we're experiencing in the steel sector via imports coming in from Vietnam, China, and I think it was also Mongolia to some degree, if I'm not mistaken. So we've had to push back against those, just as we are negotiating preferential access for our goods on the other side. I'm making this point, Chair, to say it is in the nature of this work that we do, and in the strategic role that ITAC plays. It provides us with an instrument for defensive industrial policy measures, and the Commissioner will, of course, get into the detail of what that looks like. So with your permission, Chair, I will hand over to the Commissioner, Mr. Ayabanatawe, to take us through.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister Godlimbi, and to the Ambassador Mlumbi Peter, for the earlier presentation, which I think foregrounds a lot of what, in practical and administrative terms, we may wish to say. And also to thank you, Honorable Chair, Honorable Masina, and the members of your committee for the opportunity to come and reflect alongside yourselves about the key issues emerging from our 2026-2027 annual performance plan, and similarly the strategic and the geo-economic context wherein that particular plan sets out a specific course of action for the Commission. I think the Deputy Minister has outlined key parts of the context in his earlier remarks and also in the remarks that he has just made. In particular, of course, the diversity of the picture from a product market perspective, which is the context we have to respond to. And it is a context of persistent and chronic overcapacity in key product markets, whether you are considering this from agro-processing right through to the building supplies sector, steel tubing, stainless steel sinks, glass, ceramics, and so on. And I think this context has given rise for the Commission to a growing caseload in a context wherein we are faced with operational resourcing and other challenges, which we'll get to in the presentation. So I just wanted to make those remarks and to thank Chair the opportunity for us to be able to come and speak to the Portfolio Committee about some of our work. Let me then, as I try and move the slides, try and move with some speed. I think this context is well known to members of the Portfolio Committee. We're a Schedule 3A entity. And in broad terms, our mandate is to foster economic growth and development and promote investment and employment through the efficient and effective administration of trade instruments. We are composed of a commission that has full-time and part-time members. Legislatively, we ought to have 2 full-time commissioners. We have 1 at the moment, which is the Chief Commissioner, and the Deputy Chief Commissioner role is vacant. And we have 6 part-time commissioners, some of whom have joined us recently, and I think we welcome that addition to some of our work. The Commission meets twice monthly. Initially, it was monthly, but we have had now to meet twice monthly to contend with a rapidly rising caseload. And the Commission's task is to evaluate applications in investigative processes over tariff amendments. So these are amendments to the tariff schedule, in trade remedies, which is what the Deputy Minister had highlighted. And by trade remedies, we really mean measures that look to contend and defend against unfair trade. Whether that unfair trade is manifest in price forms, which is dumping, where the price at which goods are landed in South Africa is lower than the price in the origin market, whether that is countervailing measures, which is trying to deal with unfair trade that's manifest in the subsidization of specific products for export, or whether or not that is dealing with unfair volume effects through the use of a temporary safeguard mechanism for 3 years or so. And we also administer authorizations for the prohibited and restricted list of products that are placed under import and export control. We issue those permits, but we also undertake enforcement in very risk and vulnerable product segments that are vulnerable to illicit economic activity, working alongside other entities in our ecosystem, including the receiver of revenue and other institutions as well. Maybe just we'll get into some of the detail of some of the indicators, but broadly, I think it's sufficient to say at this stage, Honorable Chair, that the Commission in its 26-27 annual performance plan has categorized its work and key measures of performance into 5 categories. These are process or timeline efficiency related indicators. You also have indicators that look at the ex post impact of the work that we have. We also have indicators that are looking at the promotion of transformation and also the promotion of industrialization. And then we also have indicators that are looking into the modernization of how it is that we do our work. And you can see that whether that is in the automation of our permit authorization, the issuance of import and export permits, issuance of rebate authorizations, or the issuance of any authorization under any program wherein the Commission has an administrative role. And one such program, which is lifted up at the level of our APP indicators, is the Automotive Production and Development Program. And you will see there that in our timeline efficiency indicators, we have a focus on the issuance and the efficient issuance of authorizations that are associated with eligibility of firms to participate in the APDP, and of course, the calculation and computation of the duty offsets they would generate arising from particular sourcing and supplier choices that they would make that deepen local content and local value addition. We also, as we look at some of the efficiency measures, have certainly been trying, and I think the Commission has had this challenge for the last few decades, of trying to bridge the expectations in the society that the defense measures in particular are expeditiously applied, and managing that alongside the procedural requirements that flow from Act 71 of 2002, the anti-dumping, safeguard or countervailing regulations, and more broadly, the WTO agreements on dumping and the agreements on safeguards, and even the agreements on anti-subsidy or countervailing measures. And I think we'll certainly reflect when we get to the table of the indicators to how it is that we score relative to some of our counterpart institutions who are faced with the same challenges. Not unique to South Africa, that you have this lament that your processes are taking too long. It finds expression similarly in China, in the United Kingdom, in Australia as well, where similar institutions are also faced with the same balancing act between speedily instituting the relief sought by industry alongside making sure that our processes have a considerable amount of procedural integrity. And we'll say a bit more about that in the coming slides. We also have indicators that are focused at also getting a grasp, and a much better grasp, of the welfare and the distributional implications of our measures. Precisely because of how the South African economy is structured, you are likely to have firms further upstream in value chains who would agitate, well within their means to do so, for trade measures, but those measures may have a cost-raising implication for downstream producers wherein we may, for policy reasons, be wishing to target those because that's where the value addition and where the employment and potentially prospective investment might lie. And so increasingly our work in the reports that sit before the Commission and the determinations that go to the Minister of Trade and the Minister of Finance are looking to analyze, one, the effective rate of protection, secondly, the distributional impact, and then thirdly, in line with the MTDP's focus on reducing the cost of living, also consider to what extent in food-related products do we see our tariff and other decisions having a cost-raising effect for households and therefore having an implication for consumer welfare. We're also interested in looking at some of our indicators around a transformation, whether these are the attainment of a particular scorecard level or a certain share of measurable procurement spend being under preferential procurement, right through, in line with Section 10 of the BBBE Act, to considering in the volume of authorizations we issue, as that Act requires, to what extent those issuances have due regard for the prevailing sector codes as social compacts for transformation in all of these sectors. And one example may be potentially the agricultural sector, where our issuance of rebate and other authorizations, we would hope in the coming year, contends with some of the targets of performance that have been set out in the Agri-BEE scorecard. So that's just one example where you have a product market whose link with the authorizations we have does require at the level of our guidelines issued in line with Section 60 of the Act, that we have some due regard to the progress of the applicant towards the goals that have been set out in a sector code as a social compact rather than an imposition in any sense from the government. We're also looking, of course, in line with our mandate at jobs and investment arising from our measures, and also, of course, trying to intervene through self-initiation in some of the sectors that have been rendered vulnerable to unfair trade and import competition. This slide also briefly highlights the interface between some of our indicators and the outcomes that we seek, and of course the sector priorities as set out in the prevailing industrial policy. And really, it is about, in broad ways, trying to contend with input costs in industrial firms, whether that is in the steel sector or even in the clothing, textile, footwear, and leather sector, alongside efficient management of the tax-related offsets, for instance, in the automotive sector, and the provision of timely and market-responsive protective measures in many of our agricultural sectors, which have to contend with subsidized import competition, as Ambassador Mlumbipita was saying earlier, which is a very thorny matter in even our multilateral engagements and even in the challenges that we're seeing at the WTO. So really, this slide is just about unpacking that and really looking into the sectoral incidence of some of the measures that we have and what it is they try and achieve within the prevailing master plans in some of these sectors. So these are the indicators, honorable members, and I think we set out the targets in the presentation that we shared. As I indicated earlier on, the indicators are grouped into categories that span from timeline and process efficiency right through to more strategic impact indicators and those looking at the promotion of transformation and industrialization, and also targeting specific areas in line with our mandate, such as jobs. And in the case, I guess, of the green steel sector, growing the share of good quality scrap that would otherwise be destined for export, that is then channeled to meet the demand of our local foundries and mills in order to diversify the emissions content of the kind of steel that we produce, undoubtedly in response to some of the challenges that Ambassador Mlumbipita was raising of more prohibitive terms of access to key export markets arising from environmental or other considerations. We're also interested, if I am to say, in line with our transformation objectives, in ensuring that the identification, recruitment, and retention of high quality talent in the form of young work seekers who are coming out of our higher education system and ensuring that the Commission becomes a favored place of work for them. And this is not only translating into our internship policy, but also some of our career outreach and engagement work that we've been doing, which is engaging many of the higher education institutions, not just in industrial provinces, but also in some of our rural provinces, with a particular emphasis and focus on historically Black institutions, with the idea being to identify early on, expose some of the high quality talent to what it is the Commission does, and in so doing, ensure that there are viable pathways for them to enter and remain in the institution. Much of the work that we do often requires specialist investigative understanding and ongoing capacity building. And I think the question of retention becomes important in a context where much of the work, specialized as it is, would then earmark many people for alternative pathways elsewhere in the public service and even in the private sector. We are also interested, as I indicated, in growing the number of authorizations where we take due regard of Section 10 of the BBBE Act. And similarly, as I said, looking into the distributional consequences of the work that it is that we do. I want to just make a comment, Honorable Chair, on the timeline efficiency indicators, especially as they relate to not just the effective rate of protection that's considered, and even amendments that regard the alleviation of input cost pressures, or put simply, rebate measures in cases where we don't produce, but also as it relates to what the Deputy Minister had raised in trade remedies. We have had a challenge. There are statutory timelines in trade remedies of 18 months for the conclusion of an investigation set out in the WTO. And with the challenges on a resourcing front that we have raised, this has become somewhat of a vexing matter for us. And so we are making a commitment here to the South African public that we wish to finalize preliminary determinations in trade remedy, and this is anti-dumping, safeguard, and countervailing measures, and finalize those preliminary determinations within 8 months. And where there's an affirmative sense by the Commission at that point, to also petition the receiver of revenue for provisional payments, which provides provisional duties while the Commission finalizes its investigation. We are looking to conclude the final determinations within 14 months. Now, there's been a lot of criticism of the Commission in the last while to say, yes, 18 months is the WTO statutory requirement, but you should be concluding these with the understanding people have of our regulations and the procedures and milestones associated with it. We think you should be concluding these in 12 months. It might be that in less complex investigations, that might be the case, where you have got a singular importer, manageable number of exporters responding that you have to then go and verify. It might be that you can conclude that in 12 months, but that assumes certain resourcing issues that may not necessarily be possible in line with our funding mechanisms, which at this stage are solely reliant on parliamentary appropriation. Let me also place this in its international context. The Australian Anti-Dumping Commission concludes its investigations into dumping at the moment in 462 days, which is 15 months. The United Kingdom's Trade Remedies Authorities concludes theirs in 70 weeks, which is about 16 months. And in the case of our own experience, and the target implied there of 14 months, we are proposing that we would do so at around 420 days or so. Now, I raise these examples to indicate that with the complexity of remedial measures, and I use two countries that have a similar exposure in that they are relatively small open market economies. If I take Australia, similar commodity reliance in the export basket, similar industrial profile, steel sector, and primary base metals as well, that are also up for protection there. And it places these matters into context. So we do indeed want to perform a bit better. We do want the 14 months to be truncated. And I think there are investigations that we currently have in our caseload where we have concluded and arrived at determinations prior to even the 12-month period. But I think it is suffice for us to say in this discussion that we have to place this in its context and alongside other peer institutions and begin to get to a safe spot that takes us somewhere. Maybe just to belabor the point, the Australian authorities in the last 12 months would have received an additional 5 million Australian dollars, around 60 million rand, which is around half of our annual appropriation, just to take on an additional function that we already have in our system, which is safeguard investigations. So they were only doing anti-dumping and anti-subsidy matters, let alone doing import and export control and even tariff amendments or amendments to the tariff schedule. And yet the additional allocation is in rand terms comparable to half of our entire parliamentary appropriation to take on two different sets of tasks and even one additional trade remedial measure. So we're also looking, as we amend our regulations, to also shorten these investigative timelines. Of course, within the ambit of what is possible. In the draft amended regulations that we've put out for anti-dumping, safeguard, and countervailing measures, we've identified a few provisions there that would give us some discretion to shorten these timelines. And similarly, we will set our sights on tariff regulations and even the import and export control policy framework to try and do something similar. I've indicated part of our modernization is to also advance from a wholly manual and paper-based system towards one that automates our authorizations in the first instance. This is issuance of import and export control permits, issuance of rebates, and other authorizations that we have. And then I think the last one is important for us. The act that was passed by Parliament gave us the funding framework in line with Section 24 of the Act that allows us to be funded by a parliamentary appropriation, by fees we would prescribe, and any other form of funding. At the moment, we are a one-trick pony. We are only funded by parliamentary appropriation, and we're looking in the MTEF period to at least be able to raise close to around a quarter of our current parliamentary appropriation and MTEF resource envelope in order to diversify our financial resource base. At the moment, around 80% or so, and I think the CFO could speak to this, around 80% of our entire operational expenditure is extended, or our parliamentary appropriation, I should rather say, is extended to the compensation of employees. Now, we don't begrudge that. Our employees are our most important and specialized assets in the organization. But the implication of it is that it leaves little room for goods and services, let alone any room for capital expenditure. And the capital expenditures that we would require in the organization are of a information technology related kind of intervention in systemic terms. When we last came to Parliament, Parliament would have known and asked us in 2024 about a cyber breach we had experienced, arising primarily to the legacy systems that we would have had. But I think our operating context has been attenuated somewhat by the proliferation of similar incidents. And of course, if anyone has been following what has been found with Anthropic, the prospect that we are likely to see this kind of cyber warfare being very much part of our terrain and a bread and butter issue for many institutions, both in the public and in the private sector. And the implication of not having that room for capital expenditure is that it then extends the turnover and life cycle of some of our digital assets, which then makes us rather open to particular forms of vulnerability within our cyber and ITC infrastructure. Let me just say a little bit more about that, and I'll skip through these slides to just indicate that since we last spoke to the committee, a considerable amount of money has been spent to try and fortify our environment, whether this is on IT security or even improving our disaster recovery capability. We managed to respond, restored our systems. We completed a forensic probe. We then, in addition to the existing cybersecurity measures we had, deepened that, including managed firewalls, hardening of our authentication procedures, full encryption across our laptops, and then, of course, also shifted and expanded our cloud capability, strengthened the disaster recovery site, which we're building at the moment, and also our policy readiness in terms of our disaster recovery and continuity policies, which all are aimed at building resilience in the organization to this new terrain within which we operate. And we are also engaged with the information regulator to try and ensure that we build on this experience that we had, a very unfortunate one, but we use that as an opportunity to further fortify our environment and also build and make more stringent our governance frameworks around our information and communication technology. So to the point I was making earlier on, we are primarily funded through a transfer payment, parliamentary appropriation. And I think it's quite clear from what we see in those numbers, the point I was making about the share of total expenditure against that appropriation that is gobbled up by personal costs, and the importance, of course, of the diversification. The honorable members would be aware that we issued draft regulations to prescribe fees in June 2024, and the minister issued those regulations. We then subsequently issued guidelines in May last year on receiving some of those comments and engaging industry. We've received those comments, and the final regulations are being processed and are with the department and the ministry to engage on that matter. And then I think this is just on the further consolidated budget. And I think as we receive the questions, the Chief Financial Officer who's with us on the line will be in a position to respond to some of those. Maybe lastly, just to say, this is our reading in strategic terms of our context and wherein which we operate. There is a need for us to really improve the qualitative features of the work that we do. But that matter is intimately woven with the ability for us to deal with our resourcing issues. We have an approved establishment of 130 posts. The current headcount sits at the moment just around 100. We've got an extensive vacancy. And these constraints impact the turnaround times and the reach of our enforcement activities. What it is that we are doing, well, we are doing a few things here. We're engaging with the trade branch, who has been ably assisting us with some secondments. But I think the one apex measure that we really need is the finalization of the diversification of our funding streams in a constrained macro fiscal environment that would then allow us some room to maneuver to not only fill critical vacancies, but also to put in place some buffers so that were we to be faced in future with the in-year baseline adjustments in downward fashion, that we should still be able to proceed and be able to continue our work under the right internal controls. Increasingly, I think we're also interested, some of our regulations do allow us to do this, to strengthen what we're calling our ex-post monitoring and evaluation of our measures. Whether this is tracking circumvention, whether this is tracking absorption in line with the anti-dumping regulations, Regulation 63, or whether this is about strengthening our capacity to look at the impact of our measures across different vectors of impact, whether this is consumer welfare, the cost incidence on downstream customers, the jobs and employment, and even pattern recognition, once we are in a position to automate our authorizations and begin to build some business intelligence and data patterns on the back of that. We also do have some legislative and regulatory reforms that are underway, including some of the amendments to the Act and also amendments to the regulations that we have. So I think with that being said, Honorable Chair, I will leave it there. Siyabulela kakhulu, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Colleagues, I'm not sure whether you'd want a tea break. I don't know, because you're home, so there's probably no need. And then we can take the sets of questions from you. Andrew, you'll help me who's on the line.
I will do so too.
Okay.
Mr. Thring, Chair, at the moment. Mr. Chance,
Member 3, member Chance.
Ms.
Who else is there?
Mutsukatsi and Ms.
Uh,
Schlauser-Webster at the moment, Chair.
Yes, in that order, colleagues. I'm not going to come in between you. Just shoot with your questions, and then the team will be making notes. Thank you.
No, thank you, Chair. Chair, just on the trade agreements that we have, there was my first question. I read an article, I think it was in the Mercury, which spoke about China's, and I hope I'm getting this right, and I'm open also to correction, but which spoke about China introducing to most African countries, if not the entire continent, free non-tariff trade arrangements. But in the article, it mentioned that this may be an attempt by China to allow for its huge industries to come to Africa, establish businesses, industries, and then export using their manpower, their expertise, their finance, and export back to China with zero tariffs. So while one may be applauding China for doing the opposite to what the US has done in terms of tariffs, one then would question the intent of those kinds of agreements. So I would like for either somebody from ITAC or the previous presentation on the trade agreements to comment on that. And then, Chair, perhaps just two or three other questions. With regards to ITAC on its the tariff policy and industrialization impact, how does ITAC measure the real economic impact of its tariff adjustments on local industrial growth, particularly in sectors identified in the reindustrialization strategy? And perhaps if you could just unpack what are the specific targets for 2026, 2027 in this regard. And then, Chair, just on one of my favorite topics and matters that I raise repeatedly here at DTIC is the aspect of beneficiation. So how does ITAC's APP align with the efforts to promote beneficiation, particularly of South Africa's raw materials? Because unfortunately, currently, we are still largely exporters of our raw materials, and I often say importers of not just finished products with value add, promoting employment in other countries, but also importers of missed opportunities. So how does your APP align with the efforts to promote beneficiation of our raw materials? And then what are the indicators? And I've called for a beneficiation index in this regard. But do you have any indicators to ensure a reduced reliance on exporting unprocessed commodities and goods that can have value add in South Africa? And then perhaps, Chair, my last question is just illegal imports. Perhaps if ITAC could specify just very clearly what are the strategies, performance indicators in place that they have to strengthen enforcement against illegal imports, including under-invoicing and the circumvention practices that undermine local industries. And I'm glad that I think it was the DM, Godlimpi, who indicated that there are some countries who actually practice dumping and then also utilize their subsidies, which severely underscores our industries and businesses in South Africa, where there is no equal or level playing field, particularly when it comes to subsidies that other countries actually employ to undercut countries like South Africa? Thank you, Chair. I think those are my questions.
I think I'm next, Chair. Mr. Shan's here. Thank you very much to the DM and to the Commissioner. I think that the presentations very much illustrate the fact that we have an export and a trade ecosystem which goes beyond just the mandates of these, of the trade desk and the and ITAC. And obviously that is couched in terms of the butterfly strategy. But we had a very sobering presentation from the ECIC a week ago, in which we were told that 200 companies, roughly 5% of exporters, account for 95% of export value from South Africa. And that shows a highly concentrated export base. So, for example, this compares with somewhere like Germany, where the Mittelstand, which is the collection of small to medium enterprises, thousands in number, are exporting to all over the world. And admittedly, they are now coming under pressure because of the disturbances to the trade flows as a result of America and other countries' actions. But I just want to make that point because it must be the objective of this department to not just negotiate trade agreements, which are important, but also to follow that up with as much support and financial and non-financial support to our exporters to penetrate those markets. It's as though your trade relations negotiations are the sort of are the generals negotiating the terms, but you need the frontline troops, which is the exporters, to come in and follow up and actually do the work of selling South Africa's goods and services into those markets. So I'd just like to get the Deputy Minister's comments on that, and whether you see that there is an integrated approach evolving within the department that is going to give that boost to our exports into all those markets which you've described. It is a concern that there are countries in Africa that are pushing back against AFTA. And I just want to know what are the signs of that trend being reversed, and that particularly non-tariff barriers in Africa, which have always been a problem, are being addressed. And then on the subject of non-tariff barriers, I'd like to know from the DM whether you or Minister Tower has yet met with newly appointed Ambassador Rolf Meyer to discuss the strategy for the United States. I noticed that discussions are taking place in May, but also has a meeting taken place with Brent Brazell, the American ambassador? Is there any sign from him that the demands from the American trade desk around South Africa's non-tariff barriers are being relaxed or not, as the case may be? Then on the issue of ITAC per se, Commissioner Cowie makes some very important points about balancing the issues of distributional impact and the cost of living versus protecting particularly upstream manufacturers. And of course, there are obvious examples of that, most notably being steel and ferrous metal sector. And I think that this is where the point that he made towards the end of his presentation about ex-post impact measurement becomes very important, and Mr. Thring mentioned that as well. And I do regard that as being absolutely vital to what your mandate is, Commissioner, because it's all very well to impose these policies, with the various instruments and measures, but you have to understand and quantify what their impact is, down to even the firm level, not just the sector level, but down to the firm level. How is it actually impacting companies' ability to trade and expand? And then again, that comes back to the localization and local content issue, because that must, in my view, be linked to developing those companies' ability to export. Because if you don't do that, and also export competitively and produce and manufacture competitively, because if you don't do that, then that will inevitably lead to increased costs in the downstream supply chains and eventually in consumer pockets. So it does require a very broad-based approach at a ministerial level as well as a entity level to make sure that the overall impact on the economy is focused on job creation and on economic growth. And the policies that are put into place must have that long-term impact in view. I am very concerned about the fact that there are 30 vacant posts. And it does make sense that you should increase your non-government revenue, the Commissioner. I'd like to know about the 6 part-time commissioners. Who are these people? What is their full-time job, if they have full-time jobs? But what is their experience? What are their actual qualifications? Because obviously the concern that I have and it has been expressed numerous times is the time that it takes, and I know you have labored the point, but we have an average tariff investigation open for 27 months, and the oldest open investigation was open for 64 months, which really doesn't seem acceptable. And then a particular question in terms of interested parties only have 4 weeks to respond to a tariff investigation, which can be extended by 2 weeks. And why is this being proposed? Then also the 2 anti-dumping investigations exceeded their 18-month time limit in 2026. Can you maybe give us some indication as to why that was the case? And then, yeah, it was the first time that I recall being told about this cyber incident. And I noticed that you added that slide. That slide that you showed was not included in the presentation that we received prior to this meeting. Do you believe that 7.8 million rand that has been spent is sufficient to reduce the risk to nearly zero of further cyber attacks? Because we have seen, obviously, with the SABS being the most critical, that cyber attacks have become a problem in entities. And do you believe that you are now safeguarded from the negative effects of a cyber attack? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chairperson. I think I'm number 3 on the list. Good morning, Chair, and good morning to the DM and all in the meeting. Chairperson, my first question will be on the first presentation, which speaks to the tariffs of the USA. My question is as follows. Despite the 30% tariffs still apply, despite the 30% of the US tariffs that still apply to the AGOA extension, what is the estimated job and revenue loss for the citrus, ostrich, wine, and nut sector in 2026? And the second question is how many companies have used the DTIC US Trade Support Desk, and what demand-side interventions are funded for 2026? And the third question will be, what safeguards are in place in the paper to protect SA industrial capacity, especially steel and automotive, with regard to the China deals? Thank you, Chair.
Good morning. Good morning to DTIC. Good morning to ITAC, and thank you very much for all the presentations. And good morning to the Honourable Chair and to colleagues on the committee. My questions, let me start perhaps with the questions to the DTIC, to the Ambassador, and perhaps the DM, which are really around the global trade shift, which they presented on. I think we're all aware of the shift from the multilateral type of approach that has been growing over the years when it comes to trade towards something that is more of a protectionist kind of system. And listening to the presentation and hearing the articulation of the strategy, it's clear there's diversification. We hear about the butterfly strategy, but perhaps what I'm looking for is something that's a little bit more defined in terms of prioritization. So are there priority markets that we are actively targeting? And I may have missed this. And if I did, I would beg for a repetition if I did miss it. But are there priority markets that we are actively targeting in response to this shift? And do we have any outcomes, any specific outcomes that we're looking for? Do we have export growth targets from those specific markets within, the next midterm period, and how are we going to track those? So that is the first, and then the second is about AFCFTA, and I mean it's been a consistent concern, the potential that we have as a country when it comes to trade on the continent and what the realities actually are. And I think we acknowledge the progress, and it's clear there are progress. I mean, there's also other aspects of trade that we know are being prioritized. I know that there's digital projects that are in place, making sure that we can leverage as far as possible from AFCFTA. But a 2.6 billion figure that we got, it suggests that we're still obviously at a very early stage in translating this trade vision on the continent. It's still relatively small when you look at the ambition that we have. And then, there's a gap between the ambition that we have on the continent and the commercial scale that's actually there. So what I'd like to know is, what would you say are the primary constraints that are actually preventing the scale? Is it logistics? Is it non-tariff barriers? What are the issues? Was it financing? What are the issues that are preventing the kind of scale that we'd want to see, or the kind of scale that we actually have envisioned when it comes to trade on the continent, but also when it comes to realizing ambitions with AFCFTA? And then I'd like to move on to ITAC. And I think even there, it would be good to have a sense of more definition in some of the aspects that were presented. I think one of the core KPIs for ITAC, and actually in the APP, is around the jobs retained and the jobs created using tariff instruments. So there are no actual numbers, and there isn't really methodology that is clear in terms of how that works. So how many jobs were actually retained and created in the last financial year, and what's the methodology that ITAC uses to attribute that job retention directly to a tariff intervention? I'm really keen to know, how do you define the fact that these jobs were retained directly because there was a tariff intervention? So if we can have a response to that. And then the second is around financial sustainability. And I mean, I understand the move toward the administrative fees that's necessary, but just a question around whether that doesn't then limit access for smaller firms. So won't there be an impact on the fees on, for example, SMMEs, emerging firms accessing the interventions of ITAC? And if so, are there any safeguards then that ensure that smaller firms can still access the remedies that ITAC offers? And then lastly, on sectors, ITAC's work seems still heavily concentrated in what were traditional sectors, traditional industrial sectors. And there doesn't seem to be visibility, or at least there isn't visibility, and maybe this is where you can clarify if I am wrong, but there doesn't seem to be visibility of any new economic sectors like digital trade, like the green economy. So why does the current sector focus remain concentrated in traditional industries? And are there any plans to play a role in enabling emerging sectors and new value chains as well? I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Chair.
Chair, the next hand was Mr. Gama, Chair.
Yes, Honorable Gama. Who else is there, Andre? Okay, Honorable Gama, you can proceed.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, Deputy Minister. Good morning, Ambassador Peter. Good morning, Commissioner Tawe. Good morning to everyone. Thank you very much for the presentations that you have made today. Mine is just really regarding the global political economy, especially Ambassador Peter, as you talk about the preparations for the next round of WTO and the fact that there does not appear to be any progress. There's no agreement on anything that relates nowadays to multilateralism, especially issues around the WTO. And I guess it's because of the growing unilateral approach that seems to be now engulfing the world, driven, I think, largely by the discovery of an ability to basically gazette new rules, especially driven at the White House at the moment. What are the lessons that are emerging in the context of the future of global trade that you have observed, that you think we should apply from a country perspective as South Africa going forward? I'm sure there are certain themes and lessons that are beginning to emerge in terms of what is the future of multilateralism. I know that there's a lot of the dependence on the WTO seems to be waning. And to what extent do you think, say, 5 years from now, would the WTO matter? And should we not also maybe just focus more on the bilateral agreements that we have with our trading partners moving forward? So for me, I think it's really just to say how are we anticipating these headwinds, and how do we want to basically play in a changing ecosystem where we might not really be such an important cog if you look at the multilateral system, but maybe we can make telling impacts on a bilateral basis. Thank you.
There are no further hands, Chair.
No further hands. Deputy Minister and the team, you can respond to the questions. Those that you cannot respond to, as we normally do, in 5 days, the team can then put them in writing so that we can share with honorable members, and then we can work towards concluding the meeting. Over to you, Deputy Minister.
Thanks, Chair, and I think the team will have to do that to provide a comprehensive written set of replies. I will just
my apologies, Chair. Deputy Minister, my apologies, but I'm really struggling to hear you. I'm not sure if it's just me, but you're sounding very muffled.
Am I better now? Am I still muffled?
Much better, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So I'll probably take about 2 or 3 of those, and then the others will be written down. The first one will be what Honorable Gama is raising. Let me start there. It's still a bit more uncertain what the direction of the global situation is going to be, and there's a couple of things to ponder around that. The first one that is emerging is that what the US thought would happen when they commenced with the tariff assault in 2020 first, and then more aggressively last year, is not playing out as they had imagined. So their calculation was that the entire world is going to run towards the bilateral agreement path, especially with them. But there's not been as great a swing as they thought there would be. So there's still an emergent commitment to multilateralism. And the reason for that is not that countries are committed to multilateralism as such, but because what is emerging is the multilateral trading system has a bit of a standardizing effect on trade rules and the possibility of how trade is structured. So the most favored nation protocol, for instance, provides that everyone gets access to pretty much the same level playing field at a multilateral level, which forces even bilateral agreements to be predicated on those levels and on those principles. What the US has done is to basically raise the floor upward. So if you think about some of the countries that went the bilateral route with the US in the earlier period, Japan, Vietnam, South Korea, they came out with a bilateral agreement that makes them far worse off than what they were initially without that. To the extent that even if they'd allowed the 25% tariffs against them, they would still be better off than what they eventually landed on the bilateral plan. Why is this an important point? It's important because there's an asymmetry of power here between the major powers and your middle and least developed countries. So if you were to take the bilateral route as the new grammar of international trade agreements, you are going to be in trouble. Even as countries are doing bilateral agreements amongst themselves to de-risk from the effects of the US issue, those bilateral agreements are still pretty much anchored around the principles of the WTO. So in that sense, the vision and principles itself of the WTO as a template are what is what everyone seems to be comfortable with going forward. Now, of course, if the WTO were to fall apart for this or that other reason, it would mean there has to emerge some broad consensus in some institutional manner that holds together the most favored nation principles that are in the WTO as of now. Now there's been a bit of talk amongst the middle powers, just the likes of Canada, South Africa, Australia, and so on, that we should view the situation for what it is and start preparing ourselves to build, let's call it a center that will be anchored around the middle power. But there's been no political move to define what that should look like. So it's pretty much the same difficulty you have with BRICS, that you have BRICS emerging as an alternative anchor, but it lacks a comprehensive trade protocol that could sort of present itself as an alternative to what we have. But I do suspect that if the situation gets worse and the Americans don't move back on what they are doing and the situation gets worse, especially for the European Union, for instance, if the European Union were to fall apart, as it is likely to do in the medium term because of their inability to hold together a binding consensus, you might have a post-WTO reality that we have to put over. So I get the point that you're raising, Honorable Kama, but as I get, in historical terms, the 5 years under review is still very short to give us a decisive sense of what direction the world is taking. That's one. Two, Honorable Chance is talking about the support that we provide to exporters in order to grow the depth of our export. So the ECIC was correct in giving that indication, Honorable Chance, and the reasons for that are mostly financial, let me put it like this. So trade is a bit of a tricky thing. So if you are selling to someone in a different country, you might have to have access to a facility that provides you with foreign currency in order to settle the transaction between the two. That's one. Then you also need insurance for the goods that you are moving from one country to the other as we go through international trade. So one of the weaknesses that we've had is the absence of a robust trade finance ecosystem in South Africa. It exists because the banks are there, but the banks work with those who are
who have proven balance sheets that they could do that, including to afford trade insurance, trade finance, and. 2 weeks back or 3 weeks back, we had a meeting with 5 banks in South Africa through the ECIC. So it was FNB, Standard Bank, Nedbank, it was RMB, Standard Bank, Nedbank, ABSA, and Investec to discuss exactly this question. Now, there were issues that are legacy problems there. I think what this conversation is exposing is that it helps but doesn't help that we come here to present entity by entity and we don't bring all of them. So part of what we are doing in order to improve our export performance is to work through the ECIC and the banks to improve access for South African SMEs to trade finance. That's the long and short of it. We've now agreed on a number of working groups together with the banks, including an impending discussion with the South African Reserve Bank on how to recalibrate what was an interest makeup scheme, which we were using as the DTIC and the ECIC to boost export performance in South Africa by enabling the banks to cover more SMEs to afford trade finance for export purposes. So there is work that is being done on that score, Honorable Chance. And in no time, we will be indicating through some public communication with the banks. And so I'm raising this because the department concluded yesterday what is our program of action with the banks. And we have about, I want to count them, I'm opening. I think we have about 4 work streams that are dealing with regulatory constraints. That is the first one. The other one is dealing with innovative solutions on market intelligence and trying to get lessons from other export credit agencies across the world on how they work. The third one is on critical industries and markets. And the fourth one was on, how do you recall it? But we have 4. That's what we actually on. And out of that, we believe that we will have a much wider basket of exporters out of South Africa with much more extended trade finance to do. So I'm going to stop there, and the team can cover the other issues. Maybe I must make the point, Honorable Webster, the point you were asking about the prioritization, I think that's what you said. It was covered in the presentation, but let me give you a summary in this way. We explained that we are not decoupling from the US market, but what we are doing is trying to find access to other alternative markets. So we counted the African continent. We can break it down internally and say East Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, and so on. Then we have the West African side as well. We can count the countries there, and North Africa as well. We spoke about the Gulf countries, so your UAE, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Bahrain, and. Then we have the ASEAN group of countries, so that's the Southeast Asia one. We have Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, and then there's China as well. Then there's the European Union. So those are the markets that we're focusing on to maximize the presence of South African goods there too. I think I will stop there, and then the team can jump in on other points. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, DM. Maybe just to add on what DM has said with regards to Honorable Thring, in terms of Chinese investments in South Africa, I think it's important to emphasize that any investment that comes into South Africa must adhere to South African domestic legislation. So we do have legislation that governs that. And therefore, as we welcome investments, it's about ensuring that they would also adhere to our laws in terms of labor, in terms of environmental issues, in terms of all the critical legislation. And therefore, it will be critical for South Africa to enforce its own domestic laws, as we do, to ensure that all investment, regardless of where it comes from, adheres to our domestic legislation and is aligned to our own development imperatives. Then with regards to Honorable Chance, I think DM has responded to the issue of the export base. And maybe it's safe to say that we also do support through other branches of the DTIC, and Honorable Chance is correct that it requires a coordinated approach to take advantage of the trade agreements that we conclude. So there is support that is provided in terms of export readiness, export development, to ensure that we are able to increase the export base. Then with regards to some of the countries that are reversing their commitments, there are instruments within the AFCFTA, including how South Africa has domesticated the AFCFTA, that ensures that we always keep the balance of concessions that have been negotiated. For example, if a country decides to increase duties beyond what they have committed in the AFCFTA, there are institutional mechanisms within the AFCFTA structures to raise those concerns, but also ultimately ensure that we reciprocate if needs be as a last resort. But there are, as I said, institutional mechanisms to ensure that we hold the countries to account for the commitments that they have made. Then with regards to the engagement with the incoming ambassador, there is one that is scheduled with the minister, including with the US ambassador. So all of those engagements are scheduled. With regards to Honorable Sophia, in terms of the tariffs that are now applicable to South African products, it's not 30% anymore. It is 10%, which is a tariff that the US has implemented on all its trading partners, including South Africa. So the 30% due to the Supreme Court ruling has been set aside. So our export are subjected to that. In terms of the products that Honorable Member has mentioned, with citrus, actually, we've seen an increase in citrus exports by about 20% in 2025 to the US, even though there are the tariffs that have been implemented. And you would have recalled that also in the process of implementation, the US also exempted some of the products, and some of our agricultural products, including citrus and macadamia, were therefore exempted from the implementation. So we've seen an increase in exports. But with regards to the number of companies that have benefited out of AGOA, we will provide that information at a later stage. DM has responded to Honorable Hlazo Webster with regards to the priority markets. I'll just also add to the list that DM has indicated India as well as Mercosur. So those are the countries that are part of our diversification strategy. Then in terms of specific markets and the growth targets, if you look at I think there was a presentation on the butterfly strategy, but we will submit that indicates the 22 priority markets as part of our diversification efforts, including the targeted products. So we can share that our export branch is pursuing. Then under the AFCFTA, we completely agree with you that the 2.6 billion is still at a minimal amount, because we are at an early stage of implementation, and it does not capture, as indicated in the presentation, the totality of our trade with the rest of the continent, so countries that are outside of SADC. But it only captures what is traded under the AFCFTA terms. In terms of constraints, initial indications indicates logistics are one of the key constraints, but also the non-tariff barriers, as the Honorable Member has indicated. But beyond that, the other issue is, even though in some of the countries the AFCFTA is domesticated legally, when our products get to the border, their customs authorities are sometimes not aware of how to facilitate the trade under AFCFTA terms. And this is something that we are engaging the AFCFTA Secretariat on to ensure that it supports the members that are implementing the AFCFTA so that we deal with the teething issues in terms of how the customs authorities are facilitating trade under the AFCFTA. But I must also indicate that there is a non-tariff barrier resolution mechanism that is implemented under the AFCFTA that assists with the resolution of the non-tariff barriers. Then lastly, the point that was raised by Honorable Gama, and I think DM has addressed it completely and fully. The only addition I will make is the fact that if you look at the current trade that is taking place under WTO terms, even though there has been a slight decrease from 80% at the beginning of 2025 to 72% currently, it's still a significant amount of trade that is taking place under WTO rules, which shows that there's still value for all countries to trade under WTO rules. Of course, there's this shift that we see. And what is clear to us is that there will have to be some level of calibration of WTO rules. And it is clear that across the board, whether by South Africa or even the EU and the US, there is a need for some element of policy space to support ailing or struggling industries. And therefore, we do foresee that there is going to be a serious debate that is discussed in the WTO with regards to how do we recalibrate WTO rules to support industrial development. And this is one of the key issues that South Africa has been raising under the WTO reform discussion. And it is gaining traction from also members that initially were against that discussion. The second issue is how do we look at the bindings or bound duties that we had already agreed to under the Uruguay round. We are already seeing the EU looking to readjust its bindings for specific struggling sectors. And in this time around, they are focusing on steel. The UK is going to follow suit. And this is something that we had called for as South Africa because South Africa was notified as a developed country under the WTO rules under the Uruguay round. And therefore, we had indicated the need for flexibility for us to be able to renegotiate our bindings in the WTO, and there was resistance to that. The EU proposal under WTO reform is also calling for streamlined mechanisms for members to review for legitimate purposes their bindings in the WTO. So we do see that going forward, there will have to be some recalibration in that regard. Thank you very much, Honorable Chair and Honorable Members.
Cool. Is that all, DM, or is another person who wants to add issues?
Let's take Chief Commissioner of ITAC.
Okay, yeah, we can hand over to ITAC. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chair, and to thank the Deputy Minister Kodlimpe and Ambassador Mlumbi-Peter for dealing with some of the matters. Let me maybe try and briefly respond to some of the questions that were posed to the Commission. And I think there's a link between Honorable Tring's question and that of Honorable Hlazo Webster regarding not only the beneficiation-related indicators, but also the jobs ones. And maybe let me start with the jobs. So I think we do set out in a bit more detail in the technical indicator description the methodology used to do the tally. But Honorable Hlazo Webster, your question was also a kind of a historic-looking question. So in the past, how have we, with that particular two sets of indicators, tallied up the jobs? And it is a combination of things. But in the first instance, all applicants for tariff amendments are required to fill out a form that looks at their head count at the point of application, and also in line with a ministerial directive from 2016, expected to project going forward, were they to receive a favorable outcome in their tariff application and afforded enough of the demand space or a greater share of demand in the domestic economy arising from that measure, would the expansion in their production yield new jobs? Now, we can debate the attribution issue, because certainly we would not be naive to think that that can solely be attributed to the activities of the Commission. I think there would be other operative factors, both of a microeconomic and a macroeconomic influence on the decision to add an extra kind of role in their headcount structure. But what it does help us with, this self-declaration by firms, is to give us a sense of what would be the new jobs arising from the measures or enabled by the measures. Maybe that's a better kind of verb, which is the same verb we use in our output measures. Now that's on new jobs. But as it relates to jobs retained, which in the past annual performance plans and our annual reports we would have framed as jobs supported, there we take a look at the prevailing and existing headcount of the firms who come to us at any one point and ask for trade measures. And let me give you just a historic sense, Honorable Hlazo Webster. In the 2023-2024 period, the reported outcome there of the prevailing headcount of firms who have come to us for support, and wherein on that support being provided, a decision has been made to retain jobs. That was about 130,527 workers. So 130,527 workers in 2024-25. And in the 2023-24, we saw 112,142. So it's a fluctuating number, fluctuating informed by the caseload, the type of firms who come and apply, and of course their own headcount. And we tally all of that up, one, to give us a figure of the job supported or retained. And similarly then, in terms of new roles, we would then only allocate that to tariff amendments and then consider the self-disclosed headcount numbers or additions to headcount that the firms would be providing us with. Let me then come to an answer on the beneficiation question. If one looks at the first page of the annual performance output indicators, there's an indicator there that is looking at growing the share of successful offers for scrap feedstock material that would have otherwise been destined for export that is made available to local consumers. Now, when we talk of beneficiation, it's not just only about virgin raw materials or virgin ores. But similarly, if we think about greening the emissions content of the steel we produce, then ferrous scrap is a strategic input material, which prior to the export control measures was being exported in voluminous tons out of the country to other countries with electric arc furnace technology. And since those export control measures have been put into play in line with Section 6 in the form of the price preference point system, we have then been able to track what share of firms who would have applied for export permits then successfully offer that scrap to domestic mills, who then add value to it, beneficiate it in their foundries and mills here domestically. That's one measure. The other is that we are also working quite closely with our other counterparts in line with a cabinet decision that has been taken to place certain materials under export control in line with Section 6. And a big part of that process, as it comes to conclusion, will include the incorporation of critical materials and strategic input material into the ferroalloy sector, and the placement of those under an export control system that ITAC would administer. So, Honorable Thring, these are the levers that we would have at our disposal in our export control list, in ensuring that some of these scraps and waste material that is crucial to downstream fabrication and beneficiation be placed under some form of export restriction in order for us to tally what is leaving the country. And of course, facilitating the export of those that meet the conditions of the export permit regime. Then just on illegal imports, I think we made the point in the presentation that the reach and the force multiplying capability of our enforcement activities is a direct function of the resource envelope or resource space that we have. And so we are working in a series of multi-agency platforms, including the Interagency Working Group and now the National Illicit Economic Disruption Program that the President has announced, alongside other agencies to try and strengthen and multiply our efforts in enforcing in critical and vulnerable product categories. Whether that is scrap, whether that is illicit importation of clothing, textiles, and so on. A lot of that work is certainly much of what it is that we are busy with. And some of that finds expression in the operational rather than kind of the annual performance plan. But we do anticipate that on the finalization of the export control regulations, that element of the export controls on the ferrochrome and ferroalloy sector will certainly be a crucial part of our performance reporting going forward. Let me come then to the questions that Honorable Chance has been raising. I take the comments and the points, I think, on the distributional questions. And I think the point on quantification, I would have answered in the earlier response. And so too do we note the concern on vacant posts. Just briefly on the new part-time commissioners who have since been appointed by the President in line with Section 8 of Act 71 of 2002. The new part-time commissioners is Mr. Mpoli Khote, who is with the Tax Policy Unit at the National Treasury. The other is Ms. Philippa Rodseth, who heads up the Manufacturing Circle. The other is Mr. Siyabulela Tsengiwe, who is a former Chief Commissioner of the Commission. And the other is Ms. Numisa Mqata-Mhlauli, who's the Chief Director for Agro-Processing in the DTIC. And the other part-time commissioners who would have been incumbents, who are still with us, is Mr. Wandile Sihlobo, who is an agricultural economist, also with AgBiz and the Presidential Envoy for Agriculture. We also have as the chair of our commission, Mr. Etienne Flock, who is the Industrial Policy Officer at the Southern African Clothing, Textile Workers Union, SACTU. And we also have Ms. Phozisa Mbiko, who works in the Excise and Customs branch of the South African Receiver of Revenue. So certainly not any of the people that you may have wished to characterize there, Honorable Chance, as people who may be novices by any stretch of the imagination, or anybody kind of helicoptered in without any capability. But these are people who have a working affinity, capability, and experience with the work that we do and the industrial sectors that we oversee. You also asked a question about the 2 investigations that lapsed. Indeed, gazettes were issued in the Government Gazette for bolts and screws on the 5th of February in a dumping matter that expired, and the reasons for the termination were set out there. And similarly, on the attire circumvention matter on the 27th of March, where the reasons were set out. Suffice to say that in both of the matters, the finalization, now the finalization isn't only the Commission concluding its investigation. It is also the 2-stage authorizations of the Minister of Trade and the Minister of Finance I alluded to earlier. It is when those series of authorizations are not finalized by the 18-month period that we are compelled to terminate. And I think it underscores the point we have been raising, that the longer we allow the resourcing or inadequacies to fester, the longer we are likely to have constraints to our ability to expeditiously conclude investigations. There are, in the one matter, I guess, in the tires matter, as the Gazette indicated, there was an inclination and a preference on the part of the executive authorities to refer the matter back. And because the timing of that would have been in breach of the 18-month threshold, it is for that reason that the matter terminated. And so we are still awaiting certainly some of the written reasons for the referral back in that particular matter, which would then allow us to issue the report that the Commission had sent as a determination. So I hope that answers that. On the cyber incident, I don't know, Honorable Member Chance, where maybe you might have been, but I also must not be naive to think that the term of this committee would have started at that time. It might be that it was in the intervening period where the Parliament was yet to sit. But we came before the Portfolio Committee on the 28th of August, 2024. And in our submission at that time, we spoke to the cyber incident we had experienced in the latter part of the preceding year into the early parts of that year. We were even asked a question by lawmakers as to the disclosures that subsequently followed and what it is that we were doing to fortify our environment. Suffice to say that we then found it important, having already sent the presentation, to at least include a slide that talks to what it is we've subsequently done, because that was a matter that had been raised by the Portfolio Committee with ourselves. Is the 7.8 million sufficient? We would imagine not. But you see, how long is a piece of string when you are faced with a macro fiscal environment where even that 7.8 million is probably beyond the bounds of your own affordability? So we would like to do more. We just don't have money. And so we would really, as we try and diversify how it is that we are funded, as we are allowed more space to do that and invest in CapEx terms in our ICT ecosystem, we would probably do a lot more closer to what would be adequate to effectively fortify our environment. But the threats themselves also morph, as the point about Anthropic I was making earlier indicates. That does sometimes feel like a bit of a game of whack-a-mole, that you may fortify your environment in line with your own understanding of the existent threats, and then find with the technological advances in the space that the threats morph and kind of shift and vary in a manner that leaves you vulnerable, and then you have to spend a bit more. So I think that for us is part of the challenges that we are confronted with. Honorable Hlazo Webster raises the point about our administrative fees. We issued guidelines, and in the guidelines that we issued, and I indicated we issued those guidelines in May last year. When we issued those guidelines, we indicated in guideline 5.5b that there would be public interest reasons for us to not charge certain applicants for fees. And we indicate what those might be. Anything from an individual who may be asking for a permit for something for personal use, right through to the SMMEs, firms among the previously disadvantaged or firms emerging from distressed regions of our country. And we set that out as something where the Commission may exercise some discretion in not necessarily levying fees. Last question, are we too focused on industrial sectors? Well, I think we're a creature of statute, and the statute at this stage behoves us to investigate amendments to the tariff schedule that is in line with the tariff book as it currently stands informed by the Customs and Excise Act of 1964. And that tariff book is looking, Honorable Hlazo Webster, at the goods trade. We recognize that over the length and breadth of the world, the services trade is constituting a growing and greater share of national output. And certainly subject to any amendments within the statutory scope of our work, we would not be favorably disinclined to looking into visibility on services or productive services and so on. We are engaged in the green economy. We're busy actually with a tariff review, looking into component production locally and possibilities for that, in line with the Renewable Energy Master Plan and our prevailing policy on renewable energy, looking at a detailed product level across the different vectors of technology, solar, wind, biogas, and so on, and looking at the tariff structure in the tariff book of some of those products, where South Africa has some capability, within the technologies and even in balance of plant. And we certainly hope that once that matter is finalized, we can then bring that to the attention of the portfolio committee. So we are engaged in some of these new technologies and even in new areas of innovation within existing products, whether those are kind of rebates responding to formulaic innovation and improvement in how it is that you make soap, for instance, which we were busy with in a rebate that we had for palm oil and extractives of palm oil and other elements. So I think the sense that much of our work is only in the traditional industrial heavy kind of industry type base, I think is probably part of the picture. But increasingly, we are also going into new arena and new terrain in response to technological advances and innovations in many of the product markets. Thank you once again, Honorable Chair, for indulging me, and also to the honorable members for all of the questions.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Are there any further follow-ups so that we can go towards concluding the meeting from members?
I don't see any hands, Chair.
No, thank you very much. I think, colleagues, it's very clear from the two presentations that the global trading system has somehow been greatly affected by what is currently taking place. And we are happy that as the country, we are not sitting back, relying on traditional systems that have existed over time since the World War II. But we're beginning to craft response strategies that are talking to alternative markets as presented in the branch, as well as also the work that we are doing through ITAC to make sure that our own industries are protected, but we're also enforcing our own local laws in the country. I'm happy that there has been this kind of deliberation, and we shall use these presentations, especially the level of the update and APP, just to make sure that we do our oversight work in holding the department to account. Because if we do these things and we do them well, as articulated by the Deputy Minister, we will see positive results, like we're seeing the positive surplus that is being recorded at about 202 billion, which is not a bad thing given the dynamics that are shaping our global economic system. I am happy that the committee has been able to engage, and then those questions that might have been asked that requires further elaboration, and the team will be free, DM, to engage with those. I will now allow you an opportunity to say the last way so that we can then conclude the meeting. DM. If there is nothing to say, let me take this opportunity to thank members of the Portfolio Committee for their engagement and remind them that tomorrow we have a physical meeting in Cape Town, and then the team will share the venues and everything to continue with our oversight work. And then the branch as led by Mulumbi, and then thank ITAC as well as the other important stakeholders as led by the Deputy Minister. The meeting is officially adjourned. Thank you very much. Andre?
I'm you, Chair.
Yeah,
Recording stopped.
The meeting is adjourned.